This week on The Record, the right to carry firearms out in the open. We talk to the judge who advised City Hall behind closed doors. Planes, trains, and automobiles. The vehicles that get us where we're going rely on solid foundations. We dig deeper under concrete, asphalt, and rebar to find what pays for it all. Our one-on-one with U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. All happening right now on The Record. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. If you were to pick the top 10 political stories in St. Louis this year from a hat, you'd be hard-pressed to find one of them that didn't have some nexus to violent crime. From the mayor's fight with Jefferson City to retain local control of the police department, to the failed push to raise the legal age to carry guns in the state, or the ouster of former Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, each of these issues all revolving around the police effort to improve public safety in the streets of St. Louis. And with disturbing images of young teens carrying semi-automatic rifles in the open, flashing across our screens, in between reports of mass shootings in downtown, the city could be coming closer to taking action on its own, separate and apart from the Republican-led state legislature. Alderwoman Kara Spencer won unanimous support at City Hall for her measure to require people carrying guns in the city to also have a concealed carry permit. That would automatically mean no one under 18 could carry a gun in public, adding local enforcement to a federal ban on minors carrying guns. But Mayor Tashara Jones had raised questions about whether that plan might pass judicial scrutiny. Joining us now to provide some of that judicial scrutiny, retired Judge Robert Durker, now on The Record. And Judge, we checked the record, the state law, and it says that the General Assembly, quote, preempts the entire field of legislation touching in any way firearms, components, ammunition, and supplies. But you seem convinced that the preemption here, there's a path through it. If someone pulls a gun out or pulls the trigger, that's the catch.
Well, the statute preempting local control had a specific proviso that the Board Bill 29, the city proposed ordinance, mirrors. And it had a very specific language allowing local governments to regulate certain aspects of possession of firearms, particularly open carry. So the state statute contemplated exactly this type of regulation.
And yet that regulation, that avenue, seemed to be hiding in plain sight for some time. Any idea why?
It was. Well, I think partly because it was in a section of the revised statutes that you would not normally look at for this language. And I confess that I didn't see it when it was enacted. It was brought to my attention when an attorney, I think it's Joe Taylor, wrote an opinion and cited Chapter 27. And so when I looked at Chapter 27, I thought, oh, yeah, there it is. It's an open door for this very specific regulation.
I see. And we brought you here, invited you here in part because of the letter that you wrote to the Board of Aldermen that said the new open carry or concealed carry permit ordinance is one of these four things. Your letter said this, quote, 1, it's within the authority of the city charter. 2, it's in complete harmony with state law. 3, it conforms to the Second Amendment and the Missouri Constitution. And maybe the most important part, your opinion that it would most likely be upheld by the courts. How did you reach that fourth opinion, that the courts wouldn't overturn this?
Well, I mean, the conclusion follows from the earlier analysis. The city charter gives the city considerable authority to regulate a lot of things. And so there's clearly no problem with the city. For many years, the city had a locked container ordinance, which was never challenged. It was seen as within the city's police power, consistent with its constitutional charter authority. And then the statute on preemption of gun regulations by localities had this specific exception. The Missouri Constitution, well, I mean, I confess, you know, I ruled on a couple of cases involving Article 1, Section 23 of the Missouri Constitution as it was amended, and I held that the statute on felons in possession could not be applied lawfully to nonviolent felons. The Missouri Supreme Court reversed me, so I have direct experience with construing Article 1, Section 23, albeit wrongly, as it turned out. And then the Second Amendment cases, the New York pistol and rifle case, which I've read carefully, I think all of those, you have the necessary authority in the city, you have the statutory authority, and you have the constitutional authority, because this type of regulation, which is not an absolute ban and does not impose insuperable barriers on people being able to carry weapons, but is a licensing regulation of a type that historically has been upheld. So I think it passes muster under all, from the standpoint of all sources of authority.
That's your legal analysis. I think some
Right.
political observers were surprised somewhat to see you involved in this, let's call it a progressive city hall. You write at some length about the Second Amendment in your book, The Tyranny of Tolerance. This is a quote, 2 excerpts from your book, quote, "Along came the illiberal liberals to whom armed citizens are anathema." Another quote, "Liberals have a way of ignoring the truth about the right to keep and bear arms." Your legal analysis here almost looks like you're in league now with these liberals that you criticize.
Well, I told Alderman Spencer that the two extremes have met in the middle here, and we find ourselves agreeing with each other on this particular proposition. And obviously I could be accused of switching sides, but I don't think so, because I think historically this is a type of measure that is entirely consistent with the original understanding of the Second Amendment. And so in that regard, I don't see myself as going against originalist principles or the principles of constitutional construction that I believe in.
This passes constitutional muster from your vantage point. I want to ask you, though, in addition, about your experience from the bench, because I imagine you've seen and you've written about criminal law. In your experience from your vantage point throughout the course of your career, have you seen clear and convincing evidence that, in fact, laws do deter some types of crime?
Well, you remind me of comments I made from the bench and doing guilty pleas on people with weapons violations. So many guns around town and so few brains. But I think that I think that the criminal law does have an effect, and I think there are some people who are completely indifferent to it, and some people who quite happily, deliberately violate it. But I think most people tend to try to obey the law, and I think the criminal law clearly has this essential role of restraining and regulating. And so I think it can have that effect. Obviously, the people I saw in court were the kind of people who were not so meticulous about obeying the law. But I think that in general, the people who did violate the law, the majority of them would get probation and were not violent people, and they would reform, if you will.
I hear you. An interesting look behind the scenes at some of the legal analysis undergirding this new board bill. Judge Durker, thank you for your time.
Happy to be here.
He ran for president 4 years ago while Pete Buttigieg was in East St. Louis this week. He's on the record next. He might have been the most popular person in St. Louis this week, at least in political circles anyways. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is on the record. Mr. Secretary, good to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
Everyone loves the person who drops off a big check, but that's easy, right? Congress did the heavy lifting there, but long-term planning is a bit tougher, I imagine. If so much of our aging infrastructure across the country is in disrepair, then wouldn't it stand to reason that some person or people in power neglected it for far too long?
You know, it took about 30 years or 40 years of underinvestment to get to the point that we're at today. That's one of the reasons why we pushed so hard to finally get the job done with the infrastructure package that the president signed in his first year, now about 2 years ago. The previous administration said they were going to do an infrastructure deal, but it never happened. And, frankly, multiple administrations and multiple Congresses just couldn't quite get there. Now that's changed. changed. We've got this funding, we've got the opportunity, but it's one thing to announce the funding, it's another to actually see these projects through. So another big focus of ours is delivery. We want to shorten the time between when we make an announcement, congratulations to St. Louis or to any community you got picked for this project, and toward the phases of actual construction and moving toward that ribbon cutting where the project is actually done. That could take years and years. Sometimes it has to, because these are big, complicated projects. But sometimes we can make it happen a little quicker than it used to. And what all of that adds up to is we are done with the so-called infrastructure week that became a punchline here in Washington, because you'd have infrastructure week year after year and nothing would change. Now we're at the outset of an infrastructure decade. And these transportation projects are going to be creating jobs for the rest of this decade, and they're going to be creating infrastructure that we're all going to depend on for really the rest of this century.
Yeah, long-term infrastructure projects require dedicated revenue streams and reliable funding sources. The Biden administration right now is nudging American car buyers to ditch the gas guzzlers and steering them instead toward the electric vehicle lot. That seems to create at least two problems. One, it blows a hole in the highway trust fund, and then is it fair that electric vehicle drivers get to use the same roads as everyone else without paying gas taxes to fix them?
Well, the truth is the gas tax has not covered the needs of our highway system for some time. And so the way that Congress has approached that is by filling in that gap with general dollars that Congress appropriates. I think there's an open question right now about what should be done in the long run as gas becomes less and less proportionally a part of how we fuel our cars. Until some years from now, it's not a significant share at all. What that means, of course, is that you can't count on a gas tax to fund our road needs. Now, different states have approached this in different ways, whether it's assessing a comparable charge on the registration of electric vehicles, or a charge on the electricity itself, or a charge on the vehicle miles traveled. There are lots of different ways to do this, and the different states do what they do best, which is create policies that make sense for them. For the long term federally, we're going to have to decide whether we're going to come up with a new system that is an equivalent to the gas tax, or whether to use general fund dollars. But either way, the biggest principle that we're following in this administration is President Biden's clear guidance that nobody should do anything, and nobody will do anything on his watch that causes taxes to go up at all for anyone making less than $400,000 a year.
That's an interesting proposition. Perhaps we can explore that in a moment. But the infrastructure bill, Congress did try to write in part of that open question that you raised, floating a pilot program for volunteers to pay that mileage tax. But you just alluded that states are already trying that out. The federal government could do it too. There's a federal gas tax. But I guess one of the big questions for many people in our audience would be, wouldn't that be unfair to rural drivers who'd have to drive farther distances just to get where they're going?
Well, if you think about it, that's kind of how it works right now with the gas tax too. The more gas you use, the more miles you drive, the more you wind up paying. The alternative would be something that is less tethered to how far you drive, and less based on the principle of the more you drive, the more you pay, which is how it works today with the gas tax, and more just an idea of generally contributing to a transportation system we all depend on. These get to complicated, even philosophical questions, but the bottom line is that you get what you pay for, and we need to make sure that we're funding a road system, a bridge system, and for that matter, railroads and ports and airports that are going to drive economic growth for the future. A dollar invested in infrastructure is a good bet. It always pays great returns. And we I think, were able to convince the country of that in working to get this infrastructure bill done. By the way, with bipartisan support, a lot of Republicans crossed over to work with the president, work with Democrats to make this happen. Now we're focused on actually delivering those improvements that we know everybody counts on.
4 years ago, when you were running for president, you said the country needed a new generation of leadership. That was your quote. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are still the frontrunners of both major parties. Do you still believe today the country needs a new generation of leadership? Well,
what I'll say is that President Biden has made a point of including people of every background and every generation in his administration. I feel this when I sit at the cabinet table. I'm the youngest person at that table, but I look around at that table and I see a cabinet that looks like America. And I'm proud to work in an administration that has worked very hard to make sure that, again, across every way of looking at it, whether you're thinking about generations and age, whether you're thinking about men and women, whether you're thinking about the inclusion of racial minorities, LGBTQ folks, any way you cut it. This is an extraordinarily diverse administration, and I think getting that right isn't just the right thing to do in terms of fairness. I think it helps us make better decisions in the same way that it has been shown that companies with more representative boards and leadership teams are actually more profitable because they're more nimble and make better decisions. I think the same is true in a government leadership team, and we're working hard on that principle here in this department and under President Biden's leadership across this administration.
I guess the question is, are you convinced, are you persuaded from your work with the president he's got 4 more years in him?
Look, he is an incredibly energetic, focused leader. I'm proud to serve under his leadership and would be into the future as well. And we've got so much to be proud of in this administration, but also so much more work to do.
All right, Secretary Buttigieg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
She was an agitator and a hellraiser, once considered the most dangerous woman in America. We checked the record to see how her words match this moment in labor. Here's a look at your local political headlines. Illinois expanded abortion protections again this week. Governor J.B. Pritzker set up a hotline to help women traveling to Illinois from out of state and set up a family planning program for Medicaid patients in the state and opened the door to provide grant funding to abortion facilities. All 3 items part of his efforts to declare the state a safe haven for women seeking abortion. And all eyes in St. Louis are on City Hall, where an open carry bill sits on Mayor Tashara Jones' desk. She traveled to Kansas City earlier this week to attend Mayor Quinton Lucas's inauguration and to participate in a roundtable discussion with Moms Demand Action. Her curious remarks at that event that Mayor's hands are tied on gun control, raising questions about her intent to sign the bill that requires people carrying guns in the open to have a concealed carry permit. And news from the campaign trail. Jason Kander is backing Crystal Quade in the race for Missouri governor. The former Secretary of State came within 78,000 votes, running against then-incumbent Senator Roy Blunt back in 2016. Kander calls the Quade the real deal. And across the river, Congressman Mike Bost boasts a big group of backers of his own. He's rolling out endorsements from more than 100 local Republican officials by his side as he braces for a primary challenge from Darren Bailey. And Teamsters, abruptly terminated at Yellow Freight, call for federal investigations into the company's handling of pandemic-era loans that were meant to keep that trucking company on the road. We're back with a final word on their struggle next. Before we leave, we watched a troubling chapter in local labor history unfold this week. Hundreds of local Teamsters who were prepared to join a picket line found themselves instead in an unemployment line. We met several of them paying respects at the place where they earned a living for so long, one final time Tuesday morning. Later that night, as we returned for a live report, we saw one straggler, a younger guy, mid-20s. He had come back quietly to pin his vest to the gate with them. He didn't want to be seen, certainly not by a TV camera. But talking to him off camera, he saw a career in his future and felt it slip away in a flash this week. Some older Teamsters suspect the freight they used to move will find its way onto non-union cargo docks soon enough. And they're feeling dejected in this moment. But they take pride in the strength of local labor icons from this area. One, a labor crusader like Mary Jones, better known as Mother Jones, who died in 1930. She's buried not far from here in Mount Olive, Illinois. On her monument reads this quote, "I'm no angel. Get it straight. I'm not a humanitarian. I'm a hellraiser." And this one, quote, "All nations, all men of power have gone down when wealth was in the hands of a few." That does it for us this week. We do have some exciting news about the record to share with you in the weeks to come. Make sure to join us right here at the same time next week, and until then, we're off the record.